Welcome back to the channel. Before we step into the shadows of history tonight, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy uncovering the dark, strange, and often uncomfortable truths of the past that history books tend to leave out, please take a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps these stories reach more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a journey into the forgotten corners of our world. Now, get comfortable, because tonight we are going to talk about something that was once considered the most public, political, and frankly, bizarre event in a person's life: the medieval wedding night. Forget the romantic candlelight dinners, the privacy, or the intimacy you might associate with a wedding night today. In the Middle Ages, the bedding of a couple wasn't just about two people starting a life together. It was a spectator sport, a legal transaction, and a community ritual all rolled into one. Imagine, if you can, trying to be intimate with your new spouse while your entire family, the local priest, and half the village are standing in your bedroom, shouting encouragement, cracking crude jokes, and waiting to see the physical proof that the marriage has been consummated. It sounds like a nightmare, doesn't it? But for centuries, this was reality. To understand why the wedding night was such a chaotic public affair, we first have to strip away our modern ideas of privacy. In the medieval world, privacy was a luxury that almost no one could afford, and frankly, very few people even desired. Marriage was not about love. It was about alliance. It was a contract between families, a merger of assets, land, and bloodlines. And like any important business contract, it required witnesses. The bedding ceremony, as it was known, was the final seal on this contract. If a marriage wasn't consummated, if the act didn't happen, the contract could be declared null and void. So the community had a vested interest in making sure the deed was actually done. Let's walk through what this day would actually look like for a bride and groom in medieval Europe. The anxiety would start long before the sun went down. Throughout the wedding feast, which could last for days, the couple would be subjected to a barrage of symbolism and rituals designed to prepare them for the night ahead. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was medicine and magic. Guests would force-feed the groom specific dishes believed to be aphrodisiacs. We're talking about things like spiced wine, known as hippocras, which was loaded with cinnamon, ginger, and sugar, spices that were thought to heat the blood and stir the passions. They might be served savory pies filled with organ meats, like testicles or kidneys, because the medieval understanding of biology followed the principle of like cures like. If you wanted virility, you ate the parts of an animal associated with it. As the feast wound down and night fell, the atmosphere would shift from celebration to something more rowdy and intrusive. This is where the bedding ceremony officially began. It wasn't as simple as the couple retiring to their room. Oh no. They were processed to the bedchamber by a noisy, drunken crowd of guests. Musicians would play loud, bawdy tunes with drums and bagpipes, creating a cacophony meant to ward off evil spirits, or perhaps just to drown out the awkwardness. The bride would be led by her female relatives and friends, who would strip her of her wedding finery. But they wouldn't just take the clothes off. They would often fight over them. Pieces of the bride's dress, her garters, or ribbons were considered good luck charms. In some traditions, the guests would rush the bride and literally tear the clothes from her body in a frenzy to grab a souvenir. It was aggressive, it was chaotic, and it was completely normal. Once the couple was stripped down, sometimes to their shifts, sometimes completely naked, they were physically placed into the bed by their parents or close kin. Just pause and think about the psychological pressure of that moment. You are likely young, possibly a teenager. You may have met your spouse only a handful of times, or perhaps never before this day. And now, you are naked, shivering under the covers, staring up at a room full of people who are staring right back at you. But the crowd wasn't leaving yet. Now came the priest. In a deeply religious society, the church had to sanctify every aspect of life, especially sex. The bed itself had to be blessed. The priest would sprinkle holy water on the mattress, the pillows, and the couple themselves. He would recite prayers asking God to banish demons, specifically incubi and succubi, that might try to interfere with conception. There was a genuine fear that if the act wasn't blessed, the child conceived that night might be born monstrous or cursed. So, there you lie, wet with holy water, smelling the incense, while a priest chants over your naked bodies, and your drunk uncle makes lewd comments from the corner. After the blessing, the guests would finally partake in the ritual of the posset. This was a warm, curdled milk drink, often mixed with wine or ale and spices, which the couple had to share from a single cup. It was meant to give them energy and strength. In some regions, the guests would then engage in a game called throwing the stocking. The bridesmaids and groomsmen would sit on the edge of the bed, take off their stockings, and throw them over their shoulders at the couple. If a stocking landed on the groom or bride, it was a sign that the thrower would be the next to marry. It was essentially the medieval version of catching the bouquet, but with smelly hosiery and a lot more physical contact. Finally, after the games, the prayers, and the drinking, the curtains of the bed would be drawn. The heavy velvet or wool drapes around the four-poster bed offered the only illusion of privacy they would get. But the guests didn't always leave the room. In many cases, the most important witnesses, parents or high-ranking nobles, would stay in the chamber, sitting by the fire or drinking wine, listening for the sounds that confirmed the marriage was being consummated. In royal weddings, this was a matter of state security. When the future king of France or England was being conceived, the courtiers needed to know that there was no deception, no body doubles, and no impotency. For the bride, this night was fraught with a specific kind of terror, the proof of virginity. Medieval society placed an obsessive, pathological value on female chastity. The expectation was that the bride would bleed. The bloody sheet was the receipt for the transaction. If there was no blood, the bride could be accused of being spoiled goods, and the marriage could be annulled the very next morning. This led to a secret underground economy of deception. Desperate women who had lost their virginity, whether through premarital trysts, assault, or simply physical activity like riding horses, had to find ways to fake it. Midwives and wise women whispered secrets about using vials of animal blood, or hiding a small sponge soaked in blood inside the body, or pricking oneself with a needle at the crucial moment. The wedding night wasn't just a sexual act. For many women, it was a high-stakes performance where a single mistake could ruin their lives and bring shame upon their entire lineage. And let's not assume the groom was free from pressure. Male impotency was one of the few grounds for divorce that women could initiate. If a man couldn't perform, he wasn't just embarrassed, he was legally liable. In some extreme cases, if a wife accused her husband of impotence, the church courts could order a trial by Congress. This is exactly what it sounds like. Court officials, midwives, and lawyers would gather to watch the couple attempt to have sex again to prove whether the husband was capable. While this was rare and more common in later legal disputes, the shadow of it hung over every wedding night. The fear of maleficium, magical impotence caused by a witch's curse, was widespread. If a groom couldn't perform, the immediate assumption wasn't anxiety or exhaustion, it was witchcraft. Someone had tied a knot in a string somewhere, symbolically tying up his manhood. This belief was so common that the church had specific prayers and counter curses to untie the knots. But these rituals varied wildly depending on where you were on the social ladder. For the peasantry, the rituals were earthier, more rooted in fertility magic and the cycles of nature. They might scatter grain or seeds over the bed or the couple, a direct prayer for fruitfulness. In some rural areas, the couple might be required to consummate the marriage in a barn or a field to transfer their fertility to the land itself. For the nobility, it was all about dynastic power. The bedding of a queen wasn't a private act. It was a diplomatic event. Ambassadors from foreign courts would write detailed letters back home, describing the physical attributes of the naked couple and estimating their chances of producing an heir. There is a famous story about the wedding of William of Orange and Mary II in 1677, a bit later than the medieval period, but the traditions held strong. King Charles II, Mary's uncle, stood by the bed curtains shouting advice and encouragement, famously telling William, "Now, nephew, to your work. St. George for England." Imagine trying to perform while the King of England is treating you like a gladiator entering the arena. It highlights the absolute lack of boundaries that defined these moments. The couple's bodies did not belong to them. They belonged to the crown, to the family, and to the future. However, amidst all this chaos and pressure, there were darker, even more bizarre rituals that bordered on the superstitious and the grotesque. In some parts of Europe, there was a belief in the droit du seigneur, or prima nocta, the right of the feudal lord to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night before the groom did. Now, historians have debated fiercely whether this was ever actually a widespread legal right, or just a myth propagated to show how tyrannical lords could be. Most evidence suggests it was rarely, if ever, codified law. However, the fear of it was real, and the sexual exploitation of peasant women by lords was a grim reality of the power dynamics of the time, whether it happened on the wedding night or not. What often happened instead was a redemption tax, the groom paying a fee to the lord to buy back his bride's virginity, a humiliating reminder of who really owned the people on the land. Then there were the rituals designed to ensure the gender of the children. It was a patriarchal society. Everyone wanted boys. The advice given to couples on their wedding night was a mix of astrology, bad science, and folklore. They might be told to position the bed facing north, or for the husband to tie his left testicle, believed to produce girls, with a string to block the female seed. They drank concoctions of hare's womb or wore amulets made of weasel bones. The wedding night was an engineering project, with the goal of manufacturing a male heir, and love or pleasure was entirely secondary to the production line. As the night wore on, and the guests finally drunkenly stumbled out of the room, or passed out in the hallway, the couple was left in the dark, heavy silence of the room. The fire would be dying down, the smell of incense and spilled wine hanging in the air. This was the first moment they truly had to themselves. Two strangers bound together for life by law and God. But even then, the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of expectation. Would there be blood on the sheets in the morning? Would the bride be pregnant within the month? If not, the whispers would start. The community that had cheered them into bed would be the same community that judged them if they failed. This lack of privacy didn't end with the sunrise. The morning gift was a tradition where the husband would present his wife with a gift, land, money, or jewelry, the morning after the consummation. But this too was public. It was contingent on his satisfaction and the proof of her virginity. The sheet would be inspected by the female relatives. If blood was found, there was celebration. The contract was sealed. The sheet might even be displayed from a window or carried in a procession, a humiliating banner of the bride's physical submission. If there was no blood, the negotiations would begin again, often ending in violence, shame, or the return of the dowry. So, when we look back at the medieval wedding night, we have to stop seeing it through the lens of modern romance. It was a high-stakes public performance where religion, law, superstition, and biology collided in the bedroom. It was a night where you had to please your spouse, your parents, your priest, your king, and your God, all while navigating the awkward, terrifying reality of physical intimacy with a stranger. It forces us to ask, how much of our modern concept of love is shaped by the simple luxury of a door that locks? But the inspection of the sheets was merely the beginning of the surveillance. If you think the wedding night ended when the sun came up, or when the guests finally stumbled home in a drunken haze, you are looking at history through the lens of modern optimism. In the medieval mind, the act of consummation wasn't just a singular physical event. It was the opening move in a continuous legal, spiritual, and medical minefield that the couple had to navigate for the rest of their lives. The wedding night was simply the moment the trap snapped shut. To truly understand the pressure weighing on this newlywed couple, we have to look at the invisible third partner in their marriage bed, the church. We often imagine the medieval church as being obsessed with preventing sex outside of marriage, which is true. But what is often forgotten, and what is infinitely more terrifying, is their obsession with controlling sex inside of marriage. Once the bedding ceremony was over, the couple couldn't simply enjoy their new life together. They had entered a labyrinth of liturgical restrictions that made the marriage bed one of the most regulated spaces on earth. The church taught a very specific, very rigid doctrine. Sex was strictly for procreation. It was a utilitarian act, like sowing a field or kneading dough. Any pleasure derived from it was suspect. If you enjoyed it too much, even with your lawful spouse, you were committing a sin. You were effectively committing adultery with your own wife because you were placing lust above God. This theological anxiety birthed what historians call the medieval sex calendar, a schedule so restrictive it would baffle a modern couple. Under the strictest interpretations of canon law, which many pious nobles and terrified peasants tried desperately to follow, the opportunities for intimacy were vanishingly rare. Let's break down the mathematics of medieval sin. Sex was forbidden on all major feast days, which, in a society that celebrated a saint for everything, was a significant portion of the year. It was forbidden during all fast days. It was forbidden during the 4 weeks of Advent leading up to Christmas. It was strictly forbidden during the 40 days of Lent leading up to Easter. It was forbidden on Sundays, the Lord's Day, out of respect for the resurrection. It was forbidden on Fridays, the day of Christ's crucifixion, and often on Wednesdays, the day Judas betrayed Jesus. In many dioceses, it was also discouraged on Saturdays as a day of preparation for Sunday communion. If you actually sit down and do the math, counting all the vigils, the holy periods, and the days of penance, a medieval couple might legally be allowed to sleep together on less than 100 days a year. And these weren't just suggestions. This was a divine mandate. The fear wasn't just about spiritual guilt or spending a few thousand years in purgatory. The fear was physical and immediate. There was a genuine, widespread belief that a child conceived on a forbidden day would be born as a monster. If a child was born with a cleft lip, a club foot, a birthmark, or any physical deformity, the community knew exactly what had happened. They believed the parents had succumbed to lust on a holy day. The child's body was a living billboard of the parents' sin. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Every time a couple lay together, they were gambling with the soul and body of their future child. The wedding night initiated them into a life of constant calculation, where the calendar on the wall was as important as the person in the bed. However, the church wasn't the only entity trying to control the groom's performance. As the couple settled into their life, a much darker, more ancient force began to encroach on their happiness: the threat of sorcery. We touched on this briefly in the chaos of the wedding feast, but we need to go deeper, because the fear of magical castration was an epidemic that ruined lives and ended ancient lineages. In France, this specific curse had a name that struck terror into the hearts of men: le nouement des guillettes, or the knotting of the point. The belief was incredibly specific and mechanical. It was thought that a witch, usually a jealous ex-lover, a rejected suitor, or simply a malicious neighbor, could render a groom completely, physically impotent on his wedding night. They didn't need to poison him. They didn't need to touch him. All they had to do was stand in the back of the church during the wedding ceremony, hide a piece of leather cord or string in their hand, and at the precise moment the priest said the words, "I join you," they would tie a knot in the cord. As the knot tightened, so too would the groom's ability to perform be tied up. It was sympathetic magic at its most direct. The groom would find himself willing in spirit but paralyzed in body. This wasn't seen as a medical problem or a result of performance anxiety caused by the 50 people watching him. It was an act of supernatural terrorism. The fear of the knot was so pervasive that it dictated the fashion and behavior of the wedding itself. Grooms would go to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves. They would get married with a ring in one hand and a piece of rock salt in their pocket to repel evil. They would verify that their clothes had no knots in them, no tied laces, no fastened buttons, going to the altar practically undoing their own clothing to ensure no sympathetic magic could catch hold of them. Some men resorted to even more bizarre folk rituals. There are records of grooms urinating through their own wedding ring before the ceremony, a crude ritual believed to wash away any potential blockages. In some regions of France, couples refused to be married in the church sanctuary at all. They would demand the priest perform the ceremony at the church door or in a private house, simply to avoid the gaze of a potential witch lurking in the congregation. If a man failed to perform on his wedding night, the immediate assumption wasn't exhaustion or drunkenness. It was witchcraft. This accusation could trigger witch hunts. It could lead to the torture of local women, usually the outcasts or the elderly, all because a groom had too much wine and couldn't rise to the occasion. The bedroom failure became a community crisis, a sign that the devil was active in the village. But what happened when the problem persisted? What happened when the salt in the pocket didn't work, when the prayers failed, and the marriage remained unconsummated for months or years? This brings us to perhaps the most humiliating, invasive, and grotesque legal procedure in human history: the ecclesiastical impotence trials. We have to remember that in the Middle Ages, marriage was insoluble. What God has joined, let no man put asunder. Divorce as we understand it today, a legal splitting of assets due to irreconcilable differences, did not exist. You couldn't leave your spouse because you were unhappy. You couldn't leave because they were abusive. You couldn't even leave if you fell out of love. The only way out was an annulment, a declaration by the church that the marriage had never legally existed in the first place. And the surest, most unassailable ground for annulment was non-consummation. The logic was simple. Marriage is a contract to create life. If the act that creates life cannot happen, the contract is void. If the wood is not put to the fire, there is no fire. Usually, these cases were settled quietly. A few affidavits, a confession from the husband, a donation to the church, and it was done. But in high-stakes cases, particularly among the nobility, where vast tracts of land, dukedoms, and royal titles were at risk. The courts demanded proof. They couldn't just take a sad husband's word for it. They needed absolute, physical, irrefutable proof. This demand for evidence evolved into a legal nightmare where the bedroom was dragged into the courtroom and the privacy of the human body was dismantled piece by piece. It started with the trial by inspection. This was exactly as horrific as it sounds. If a wife sued for annulment on the grounds of her husband's impotence, the court would first turn its gaze on her. A panel of honest women, usually respected midwives, matrons, or widows of good standing, would be appointed by the court. They would take the wife into a private chamber, undress her, and subject her to a rigorous physical examination to determine if she was virgo intacta. These women would then have to march into open court and testify in graphic detail about the state of the wife's hymen. If she was found to be intact, it was a point for her side. The focus then shifted to the husband. The husband would be subjected to an examination by a panel of doctors, barber surgeons, and priests. They would inspect his anatomy for any visible deformities, scars, or signs of what they called frigidity. They would prod, measure, and debate his physical capabilities while he stood naked before them. They would look for coldness in the testicles or a lack of vital spirits. But sometimes, inspection wasn't enough. The human body is complex. A man might appear healthy, but fail to perform. Or, more scandalously, a man might claim he was only impotent with her due to a specific curse known as relative impotence, but was fully functional with other women. The wife might claim he was lying. The husband might claim she was tightening her body through magic to reject him. This legal deadlock led to the infamous trial by Congress. This procedure sounds like a bureaucratic meeting, but it was actually a state-sanctioned sexual performance. It persisted in France, Spain, and parts of Italy well into the 1600s, though its roots and logic were deeply medieval. In this ultimate test, the court would order the couple to attempt sexual intercourse on demand in a neutral location chosen by the judge. This might be a bed set up in a room near the courthouse, a specific chamber in a bathhouse, or even a room in a convent or monastery. But they weren't alone. The court would appoint witnesses, doctors, midwives, lawyers, and court officials to oversee the act. Sometimes they would wait behind a thin screen or a curtain. In the most extreme cases recorded in history, the matrons would stand right by the bed. Their job was to verify penetration. They were there to ensure there was no trickery, no phials of animal blood used to fake virginity loss, no prosthetic devices used by the husband. Imagine the scene. You are fighting for your freedom, your reputation, and your future. You hate the person you are with. You are suing them after all. And now, you are in a cold, strange room, knowing that a group of solemn men in robes and women with stern faces are listening to your every breath, waiting for a signal. The pressure is unimaginable. If the husband failed to perform under these impossible conditions, and who wouldn't, he was declared legally impotent. The marriage was dissolved. But the punishment didn't end there. He was often prohibited from ever marrying again. The logic was that if he couldn't perform with one woman, he couldn't perform with any, and thus he should not be allowed to trap another soul in a sexless union. It was a total social death sentence, carried out via a public performance of intimacy. These trials were a source of endless gossip and scandal for the public. Pamphlets would be written and sold on the street corners, detailing the specific anatomical failures of a count or a duke. Betting pools would be started in the taverns. Would the marquis conquer the fort or retreat in shame? The trial stripped the last shred of humanity and mystery from the act of love, turning it into a mechanical function to be measured, graded, and certified by the state. But let's step away from the courtroom for a moment and look up, way up, to the bedroom of the aristocracy. Because for kings and queens, the wedding night rituals took on an even more bizarre, theatrical quality that makes the trial by Congress look almost private by comparison. For royalty, the body of the monarch wasn't just a human body. It was the body politic. The king's physical health was tied supernaturally to the health of the nation. If the king was weak, the borders were weak. If the king was barren, the fields were barren. Therefore, his sexual potency was a matter of national security. In the French and English courts, the ritual of le coucher, the putting to bed, was an elaborate ceremony that could involve hundreds of people. The king wouldn't just go to his room and get undressed. He would be undressed by the highest-ranking nobles in the land. It was considered a supreme honor to be the one to hand the king his nightshirt. One duke would hold the candle, another would take the king's sword. The queen would undergo a similar ritual in her chambers, surrounded by duchesses and ladies-in-waiting who would strip her, brush her hair, and prepare her like a sacrificial offering. When they were finally brought together in the great state bed, often raised on a dais like a stage, the room would be packed. Courtiers, clergy, and most importantly, foreign ambassadors would crowd around. The ambassadors were the vultures of the wedding night. Their job was to write back to their own monarchs, in Spain, in Austria, in Italy, confirming that the alliance was sealed. They needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the treaty signed in ink had been sealed in blood and fluid. They would analyze every glance, every touch, every word spoken between the royal couple. In some instances, the ambassadors would stay in the room until the curtains were drawn, and then they would simply move to the other side of the door. They would sit there all night, drinking wine, playing cards, and listening. There are actual diplomatic letters preserved in European archives that describe, in excruciating clinical detail, the noises heard from the royal bedchamber. The king was heard to cry out twice. A Spanish ambassador might write to Philip II. And the queen seemed well pleased this morning. The alliance is secure. This wasn't voyeurism. This was geopolitics. But the pressure it put on the couple was crushing. One of the most tragic examples of this, though it occurred at the tail end of our timeline, it perfectly illustrates the medieval mindset, was the marriage of the future Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. They were teenagers. They were strangers. And the entire world was waiting for them to have sex. Because they failed to consummate the marriage that night, and for 7 years afterward, their lack of sex became the central topic of European diplomacy. The Queen's mother, the Empress of Austria, wrote scathing letters demanding to know why her daughter hadn't done her duty. The king's grandfather humiliated him with public questions about his virility. The public bedding ritual, meant to ensure an heir, had instead created a psychological complex that nearly destroyed the monarchy before the revolution even began. However, if we look away from the stone castles and down into the mud-brick cottages of the peasantry, the rituals were less about politics and more about survival. For the common people, the wedding night was deeply, mystically tied to the fertility of the earth. In the medieval rural mind, there was a blurring of the lines between the bride and the harvest. A woman's womb and the earth's soil were seen as the same thing. In parts of medieval Germany and Scandinavia, there was a tradition where the bride would be required to milk a cow or sow seeds in a field immediately after the wedding night, sometimes before she even washed. The idea was that the generative power of the consummation, the spark of life created in the bed, would physically transfer from her hands to the animals and the crops. Conversely, if a couple remained childless, they weren't just pitied, they were viewed as a bad omen for the entire village. A barren couple might be blamed for a bad harvest, a drought, or a sickness in the livestock. The community believed that their sterility was contagious. The pressure to perform wasn't just about family honor. It was about whether the village would eat next winter. This connection between sex and agriculture led to some truly bizarre fertility tests and cures that newlyweds were subjected to. A common folk remedy for a bride who didn't conceive immediately was to drink the urine of a pregnant sheep, or she might be told to wear a girdle made from the skin of a wolf, or to carry a pouch containing the dried womb of a hare. The logic was, like cures like. To be fertile, you must be close to fertile things. For the husband, if he was suspected of being cold or sluggish, the remedies were more brutal. He might be whipped with nettles or holly branches before bed to stimulate the heat of the blood. He might be fed concoctions of blistering peppers and spices that would burn his throat and stomach, based on the belief that physical heat in the belly would translate to heat in the loins. Pain and pleasure were dangerously close companions in medieval medicine. And what of the charivari, or rough music? This was perhaps the most chaotic and anarchic of all post-wedding rituals. The village didn't just celebrate a marriage, they judged it. If a marriage was considered controversial, say, an old, wealthy man marrying a very young girl, a mismatch of ages, or a widow remarrying too soon after her husband's death, the village wouldn't just stay silent. They would protest. On the wedding night, a mob would gather outside the couple's house. They would bring pots, pans, drums, horns, and bells. They would scream, bang metal together, and sing obscene, mocking songs. This cacophony was designed to do two things. First, to drive away the evil spirits that such an unnatural union might attract. But second, and more practically, it was designed to physically disrupt the couple's intimacy. Imagine trying to consummate a marriage while 50 of your neighbors are screaming insults and banging drums right outside your window. In extreme cases, the mob might throw stones at the house, smear filth on the door, or even break down the door to drag the couple out and subject them to public humiliation. They might be forced to ride a donkey backward through the town. The wedding night, usually a time of sanctity, could instantly turn into a riot if the community disapproved of the match. It was a stark, violent reminder that in the Middle Ages, you didn't just marry a person, you married the village, and the village reserved the right to veto your happiness. There is another aspect of the medieval wedding night that is often glossed over in historical romances because it is too uncomfortable, too dark for modern sensibilities: the age of the participants. We must remember that canon law, the law of the church, allowed girls as young as 12 and boys as young as 14 to marry. In the high nobility, betrothals happened even earlier, sometimes when the children were infants. While the church usually advised waiting until the couple was physically mature for consummation, advised is the key word. Politics often moved faster than biology. There are chilling historical records, dry, bureaucratic accounts of child brides being carried to the marriage bed, terrified and uncomprehending. The Lady Margaret Beaufort, the mother of King Henry VII, is a prime example. She was married and bedded at age 12. She gave birth at 13. The birth was a traumatic, near-fatal event that left her physically damaged and unable to have any more children. She was a child herself, forced to become a vessel for a dynasty. For these child brides, the wedding night wasn't a ritual of alliance or fertility. It was a night of sanctioned trauma. The bedding ceremony, with its jokes, its drunken guests, and its ribald songs, takes on a truly horrifying quality when you realize the bride might still be playing with dolls. The celebrations outside the door masked the cries of pain inside, and history has largely remained silent on this grim reality, framing it instead as dynastic duty. The chroniclers praise the fruitfulness of the union, ignoring the cost paid by the young girl in the bed. Yet, even in this landscape of coercion, surveillance, and lack of privacy, humans found ways to rebel. The human spirit is stubborn. There are court records of brides who barricaded the bedroom door and refused to let the groom in, holding the siege for days until their demands were met. There are stories of grooms who, overwhelmed by the crowd and the pressure, jumped out of the window and fled into the night, preferring the ridicule of the village to the performance of the bed. And there are touching, rare accounts of couples who, once the curtains were finally drawn and the guests had passed out, conspired together. They would cut a finger to stain the sheets with blood, saving the bride from shame. They would agree to lie to the waiting relatives about the success of the night. In that conspiracy, in that shared lie against the world, they forged a bond of secrecy that was perhaps the first real act of their marriage. As we move deeper into the dark history of matrimony, we have to talk about the morning after food. Just as there were aphrodisiacs for the night before, there were restorative meals for the morning after. The medievals had a very specific, hydraulic understanding of the human body. In medieval England, there was a tradition of the bride's pasty, a massive, heavy pie filled with oysters, pine nuts, coxcombs, and sweetbreads. It was believed that the couple would be exhausted and dangerously depleted of their vital humors. The medical theory of the time held that semen was made from the purest essence of blood and brain matter. Yes, they believed it was distilled from the brain and traveled down the spine. Therefore, a man who had performed his duties was literally losing a part of his mind and his life force. He was sacrificing his lifespan to create an heir. He needed to be resuscitated with high-calorie, hot foods immediately, or he might wither away and become melancholic. The bride, conversely, was seen as a cold vessel that needed to be kept warm to incubate the seed. This medical misunderstanding governed their lives for days after the wedding. They might be forbidden from bathing after the wedding night, because open pores would let the vital heat escape. They might be bled by a barber surgeon a few days later to rebalance the humors that had been agitated by passion. The wedding night was treated as a medical crisis as much as a celebration. But perhaps the most enduring and disturbing legacy of the medieval wedding night is the concept of ownership. The bedding ceremony was, at its core, a transfer of property deed. The woman was transferred from the father's house to the husband's bed. The rituals we've discussed, the shoe throwing, the ring, the public undressing, were all symbols of this transfer. In some Germanic tribes, the groom would step on the bride's foot during the ceremony to symbolize his dominion over her. In others, he would strike her, gently, one hoped, but not always, demonstrating his legal right to correct her. The wedding night was the moment this ownership became physical fact. This brings us to a strange paradox. While the church preached that the souls of men and women were equal before God, the law and custom of the wedding night preached that their bodies were vastly unequal. And yet, this was the foundation of society. Every king, every knight, every peasant who built the world we look back on was the product of one of these chaotic, public, superstitious nights. The history of Europe was quite literally written in the marriage bed. As we conclude this exploration of the bedding ritual itself, we are left with a picture that is far removed from the fairy tales. It was a world where privacy was suspicious, where virginity was a commodity, where the church checked your calendar and the village checked your sheets. It was a world where a knot in a string could destroy a dynasty and a pot of urine was a fertility treatment. But the story of medieval marriage doesn't end with the bedding. In fact, the terrors were just beginning. Because once the marriage was consummated, the couple had to survive the consequences. They had to survive childbirth, which killed more women than wars killed men. They had to survive the brutal methods of contraception that were whispered in secret. And they had to survive the dark reality of what happened when love was not enough. What happened to the unhappily married? What happened to the couples who despised each other? And what about the darkest secret of all? The deathbed wedding, where the bride became a widow before the ink was even dry. We are going to peel back those layers next. We will look at the forbidden history of divorce, the lethal potions used to end pregnancies, and the strange, sad lives of those who never married at all. The bedroom door is closed, but the secrets are still leaking out from underneath it. But if the wedding night was a trial by fire, the days and months that followed were a trial by endurance. As the couple emerged from the bedchamber, blinking in the harsh light of their new reality, they found themselves trapped in a web of traditions that we still celebrate today, though we have completely forgotten their bloody and desperate origins. Take, for example, the honeymoon. Today, the word conjures images of white sand beaches, relaxation, and romance. But in the brutal reality of the northern European tribes that shaped medieval custom, the honeymoon was not a vacation. It was a prescription. It literally referred to the cycle of the moon, 1 month following the wedding, during which the couple was legally and socially required to drink mead or honey wine every single day. This wasn't to help them relax. It was a calculated biological gamble. Mead was believed to be the ultimate fertility enhancer, specifically for producing male heirs. The couple was essentially put on a strict liquid diet of alcohol and sugar for 30 days to force conception before the next menstrual cycle could begin. If a son was born 9 months later, the credit was often given to the mead maker, not the father. But there is a darker, more violent interpretation of the honeymoon that links back to a time when obtaining a bride wasn't a matter of negotiation, but of theft. Historians call it marriage by capture. In the chaotic centuries before the High Middle Ages, if a man could not afford the bride price, or if the woman's family refused his suit, he didn't just walk away. He would gather a group of his strongest, most violent friends, raid the neighboring village, and physically abduct the woman. They would then go into hiding for a moon cycle, a honeymoon, deep in the forest or in a remote holdfast. They stayed hidden until her family stopped looking, or, more cynically, until she was pregnant. Once a child was conceived, the marriage was a fait accompli. It was impossible to undo. The honeymoon was originally a cooling-off period for a kidnapping. This violence is also the DNA of the best man. In modern weddings, he holds the rings and gives a toast. In the reality of marriage by capture, the best man wasn't the groom's best friend. He was the best swordsman. His job was to stand guard at the door of the bridal chamber, not to keep people out for the sake of privacy, but to fight off the bride's angry brothers and father who were coming to kill the groom and rescue her. He was a bodyguard, an accomplice to abduction, standing with his hand on the hilt of his weapon while the consummation took place behind him. That is the blood-soaked lineage of the man standing next to the groom at the altar. Even the charming tradition of carrying the bride over the threshold has roots in this violence. While some folklore claims it was to prevent her from tripping, which was seen as a bad omen, a more sinister and likely explanation is that it symbolized her reluctance. In a marriage by capture, a bride wouldn't walk willingly into her kidnapper's house. She had to be dragged or carried, kicking and screaming. Over centuries, what was once a scene of a woman fighting for her freedom transformed into a romantic gesture of a husband welcoming his wife. The trauma of the past was sanitized into the etiquette of the present. Once the couple was established, however, a new anxiety took hold, one that haunted the medieval male mind more than almost anything else: the fear of the cuckold. In a world without DNA tests, where lineage determined who owned the land, who inherited the crown, and who owned the very soul of the family. The fidelity of the wife was the single most valuable commodity. A man could never be 100% sure a child was his. This biological uncertainty drove medieval men to paroxysms of jealousy and control that bordered on madness. This fear birthed the infamous myth of the chastity belt. You've likely seen them in museums or Victorian-era illustrations, metal contraptions designed to lock a woman's genitalia away while her husband was off fighting the Crusades. I need to correct the record here, because the truth is more complex and more psychological. Most serious historians now agree that the metal chastity belts displayed in museums are largely fakes from the 18th and 19th centuries, created to titillate curious audiences or to reinforce the idea of the barbaric past. In the actual Middle Ages, you didn't lock your wife up with iron. You locked her up with fear, religion, and social surveillance. The medieval chastity belt was a mental construct. The church taught that a woman's body was a gateway to hell, Iannua Diaboli, and that she was naturally more lustful, weaker, and more deceptive than man. Therefore, she needed to be constantly watched. The wedding night initiated a lifetime of surveillance where the wife was never to be left alone. If the husband went to war or on a pilgrimage, she wasn't locked in metal. She was locked in the Tower of Maidens, or surrounded by elderly female relatives, dowager aunts and pious mothers-in-law, whose sole job was to ensure she didn't speak to other men. Her reputation was a glass vase that everyone was waiting for her to drop. But what if, despite the fear of hell and the watchful eyes of the mother-in-law, a woman did stray? Or, perhaps more commonly, what if she simply wanted to control her own fertility within the marriage? The wedding night was supposed to be about producing heirs, but medieval women were keenly, brutally aware of the dangers of childbirth. Death in labor was as common as death in battle. A woman entering the birthing chamber effectively wrote her will. So, in the shadows of the bedroom, a secret war was waged, the war of contraception. The church declared contraception a mortal sin, calling it homicide before the fact. Priests equated spilling the seed with murder. Yet medieval penitential manuals, books used by priests to assign punishments for sins, are absolutely full of questions about it. Have you drunk a potion to sterilize your womb? Have you placed a root in your nether regions? The fact that the priests had to ask these questions constantly proves that women were doing it constantly. Women whispered secrets to each other that they would never tell their husbands or confessors. They created a shadow network of medical knowledge. They used pessaries made of wool soaked in vinegar, honey, or olive oil to block the seed. They carried amulets of weasel testicles, a recurring theme in medieval magic, or wore wreaths of specific herbs gathered by moonlight. But some methods were far more dangerous. Desperate women turned to emmenagogues, herbs that promoted menstruation, which was a coded way of saying they caused abortions. Pennyroyal, rue, savin, and silphium were brewed into bitter teas. These were poisons, pure and simple. The margin for error was razor thin. If you took too little, nothing happened. If you took too much, you died in agony, your organs shutting down as you bled out. The medieval bedroom was the site of this high-stakes game of Russian roulette, where women risked their eternal souls and their physical lives to avoid the one thing the wedding night was supposed to guarantee: a baby. If a woman was caught using these methods, or if she was caught in adultery, the punishment was swift, brutal, and humiliatingly public. And like the wedding night, the punishment required an audience. In many medieval towns, an adulterous woman wasn't just fined or imprisoned. She was subjected to the procession of shame. She would be stripped to her shift, her hair cut off, stripping her of her femininity, and marched through the streets. A jeering crowd would follow her, beating pots and pans, blowing horns, and shouting obscenities. This was known as rough music, or the Skimmington Ride. Sometimes she was tied to a cucking stool, a chair attached to a long lever, and ducked into the river or a muddy pond. The crowd would cheer as she was submerged, gasping for air in the filth. It was a ritual cleansing that was also a form of torture. The community that had celebrated the bedding ceremony, that had cheered her fertility, now gathered to celebrate the social destruction of the woman who had violated the terms of the contract. But let's turn the lens back to the husband for a moment. He had his own burden to bear, a legal concept that sounds utterly alien to us today: the marital debt, or debitum conjugale. This was a fascinating and rigid concept in canon law based on the writings of St. Paul. The theory was that when two people married, they surrendered the ownership of their bodies to one another. Therefore, if one spouse demanded sex, the other was legally required to provide it. They could not refuse. To refuse was to force your spouse into the temptation of adultery, and thus their sin would be on your head. Surprisingly, this law applied to both men and women. In the ecclesiastical courts, a medieval wife could actually sue her husband if he refused to sleep with her, accusing him of failing to pay the debt. And there are records of this happening. Women demanding their rights, not necessarily out of lust, but because a lack of intimacy threatened the validity of the marriage and the production of heirs. However, the dynamic was rarely equal. For the husband, paying the debt was often seen through the lens of medical anxiety. Medieval medical texts were filled with warnings that excessive intimacy cooled the body, shortened the lifespan, and dulled the intellect. A man who enjoyed his wedding night too much, or who paid the debt too enthusiastically, was seen as effeminate. Now, we need to clarify that word. In the Middle Ages, effeminate didn't mean a man who acted like a woman. It meant a man who loved women too much. It meant a man who was enslaved by his passions, who had lost his rational control, just as women were believed to be slaves to their emotions. The ideal medieval man was supposed to be stoic. He was supposed to enter the marriage bed with the solemnity of a judge and the precision of a farmer sowing a field. Passion was, paradoxically, considered a sin within marriage. If a man loved his wife too ardently, if he sought pleasure for pleasure's sake rather than for procreation, he was committing adultery with his own wife in the eyes of the church. Imagine the mental gymnastics required on the wedding night. You must perform, you must conceive, but you must not enjoy it too much, or you are damning yourself. This tension created a strange, stifled atmosphere in the bedroom, where intimacy was conducted in the dark, often with the couple fully clothed in chemises, with only small openings for the necessary act. The naked body was shameful, a result of the fall of man. To look upon your spouse naked was to invite lust, so the act was often quick, silent, and hidden under heavy wool blankets, haunted by the fear that God was watching and judging the level of enjoyment. And then, there was the morning after the morning after. The Morgengabe, or morning gift that we mentioned in the previous part, was not just a gift. It was a life insurance policy. In a time when women could not easily own property or inherit titles in their own right, this gift, given only after the proof of virginity, was often the only property a woman truly controlled. It was her safety net. If her husband died, which was likely given the wars and plagues, or if he cast her aside, the morning gift was what kept her from begging on the streets. The negotiation of this gift often happened in the bed, immediately after the act. Imagine the romance of that moment. The deed is done, the sheets are checked, and now the husband and wife are haggling over the price of a piece of land or a set of jewelry. It reinforces the cold, hard truth that the medieval marriage was an economic merger first and a human relationship second. But what of those who didn't fit into this rigid system? What of the secret lives that the chronicles rarely mention? We know that same-sex desire existed in the Middle Ages, often hidden in plain sight or punished with fire. A wedding night for 2 men or 2 women was an impossibility in the eyes of the law. Yet we find traces of brotherhood contracts, a frèrement, where 2 men would swear to live together, share 1 bread, 1 wine, and 1 purse. These contracts used language that was strikingly similar to marriage vows. They promised mutual support, shared assets, and often shared burial. Were these secret marriages? Historians debate this fiercely. Some argue they were purely economic partnerships or platonic bonds of extreme friendship. But for others, they suggest that even in a world of arranged marriages and public beddings, the human heart found ways to create its own rituals. Perhaps, in the quiet of a shared house, away from the prying eyes of the priest and the king, a different kind of wedding night took place. One defined not by duty or lineage, but by choice. As the years of the marriage went on, the shadow of the wedding night never truly lifted. Every time a child died in infancy, which happened to nearly half of all children, the parents would rack their brains, wondering if they had sinned on that first night. Did they forget a prayer? Did they have sex on a feast day? Did they enjoy it too much? The grief of losing a child was compounded by the crushing, superstitious guilt that it was a divine punishment for a sexual error committed years ago. The bedroom was a place of ghosts. Ghosts of the children who didn't survive. Ghosts of the lovers who were forbidden, and ghosts of the women who died trying to bring those children into the world. And speaking of ghosts, we must address the most macabre intersection of marriage and mortality, the deathbed wedding. Because marriage was the only way to legitimize heirs, sometimes the wedding night happened literally on the deathbed. Imagine a man dying of the plague or bleeding out from a battlefield wound. He has a mistress and illegitimate children who, under the law, will inherit nothing. They will be destitute. To save them, he orders a priest to be fetched. The wedding is performed in a room that smells of sickness and death. The bride stands by the bed, holding the hand of a man who is already halfway to the grave. The vows are rushed. The consummation is waived, or deemed to have happened previously. In these moments, the bride becomes a wife and a widow in the same hour. She gains a title and protection just as the body turns cold. It was the ultimate subversion of the wedding night, a union not of beginnings, but of endings. It was a transaction of pure survival, stripping away all the pretense of romance to reveal the legal machinery beneath. As we move toward the final chapter of this dark history, we have to look at how these traditions finally began to break. It wasn't a sudden revolution, but a slow erosion. The rise of Protestantism, the shifting laws of property, and eventually, the revolutionary idea that people should perhaps like the person they marry, began to chip away at the fortress of the medieval wedding. But before we get there, we have one more dark corner to explore. We have talked about the nobility and the peasantry, but we haven't talked about the outsiders, the people who were barred from this system entirely, the executioners, the prostitutes, the lepers. Did they have wedding nights? Did the church bless their beds? Or were they forced to create their own twisted reflections of these holy rituals in the darkness of the medieval underworld? If the wedding night of a peasant was a community event, and the wedding night of a king was a diplomatic crisis, the wedding night of the untouchables was a ghost story. In the rigid hierarchy of medieval Europe, there were those who existed outside the grace of God and society. Chief among them was the executioner. We often think of him as a terrifying figure in a hood, but in reality, he was a tragic social pariah. Because he dealt in death, he was considered tainted. He was often forbidden from living inside the town walls. He couldn't touch food in the market. He had to point at what he wanted with a stick. No respectable family would ever let their daughter marry an executioner. It would mean social suicide. So, how did the executioner find a bride? The answer lies in the grim formation of dynasties of death. Executioners were forced to intermarry. The son of the executioner in Paris would marry the daughter of the executioner in Rouen. Their weddings were bizarre mirror images of respectable society. They were held late at night, often in the executioner's own home, which might be situated next to the gallows or the dumping ground for bodies. Imagine the atmosphere of that wedding night. The guests are torturers, gravediggers, and knackers. The food on the table is paid for by the fees collected from beheadings and hangings. The couple retreating to the bridal chamber knows that their children will be doomed to the same fate, locked into a caste system of blood. Yet historical records suggest these families were incredibly tight-knit. In a world that hated them, their marriage bed was perhaps the only place they found acceptance. Their intimacy was an act of defiance against a society that needed their services but despised their existence. Then there were the living dead, the lepers. When a person was diagnosed with leprosy in the Middle Ages, the church performed a literal mass of separation. The leper would stand in an open grave while a priest read the burial rites, declaring them dead to the world. They were given a clapper to warn people of their approach and banished to a leper colony. But here is where the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. Lepers fell in love. In the leper houses, away from the revulsion of the healthy, they formed unions. The church debated fiercely. Could a dead person marry? Could they have sex? The medical consensus was that leprosy was sexually transmitted and that lepers had voracious, uncontrollable lusts, a cruel stereotype. Despite the stigma, leper weddings happened. They were quiet, desperate ceremonies performed by brave priests or by the lepers themselves. Their wedding nights took place in the shadow of rotting flesh and imminent death. Yet for many, that touch, however painful, was the only reminder that they were still human. In the leper colony, the wedding night wasn't about property or lineage. It was about the terrifying need not to die alone. This brings us to the great paradox of the Middle Ages. We have spent hours talking about marriage as a business transaction, a biological duty, and a legal trap. But what about love? What about the knights, the damsels, and the romance we see in movies? This is the biggest lie of all. In the medieval mind, love and marriage were two completely different things. In fact, they were often seen as incompatible. This gave rise to the culture of courtly love. We romanticize this today as chivalry, a knight wearing a lady's favor. But in reality, courtly love was a code for sophisticated adultery. The poets and troubadours openly sang that true love could only exist outside of marriage. Why? Because marriage was a contract based on duty. You had to sleep with your wife. You had to provide for your husband. There is no freedom in compulsion. Therefore, true love had to be freely given, and thus, it had to be illicit. The great romances of the time, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, were stories of people cheating on their spouses. This explains the coldness of the official wedding night. A nobleman might breed with his wife to secure the castle, but he would write poetry to his mistress to secure his soul. The bedroom was for business, the garden was for passion. This bifurcation of the heart and the loins created a schizophrenic society. Women were placed on pedestals as objects of worship in poetry, while simultaneously being treated as broodmares in law. A noblewoman might be the subject of 1,000 songs by a troubadour, but on her wedding night, she was essentially property being transferred. The romance was a fantasy used to escape the suffocating reality of the arranged marriage. So, how did we get from there to here? How did we move from the public bedding ceremony and the inspection of the sheets to the private, romantic ideal of modern marriage? It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, grinding evolution. The first crack in the fortress was the church's insistence on consent. In an effort to stop the marriage by capture we discussed earlier, the church began to insist that both parties must say, "I do," freely. At first, this was just a formality, but over centuries, the concept of consent grew roots. If you have to consent, you have to have a choice. And if you have a choice, personal preference begins to matter. Then came the Black Death. When the plague wiped out half of Europe, the old feudal structures shattered. Labor became valuable. People moved. The rigid control of the clans and the lords weakened. A young couple might survive the plague, inherit a vacant farm, and decide to marry for themselves, away from the prying eyes of a decimated village. The nuclear family began to emerge from the ashes of the pestilence. Finally, the Reformation and the Enlightenment began to dismantle the idea that sex was inherently sinful. The bedding ceremony, once a legal necessity, began to be seen as vulgar. The guests were slowly pushed out of the bedroom. The door was closed. The lock was turned. Privacy, that modern luxury, was finally born. As we look back over this long, dark history, from the aphrodisiacs of the feast to the inspection of the bloody sheets, from the legal trials of impotence to the tragic weddings of executioners, we are left with a profound realization. The medieval wedding night was not a moment of intimacy. It was a collision of every force that ruled the medieval world. If you enjoyed this long-form documentary, please like the video. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next descent into history.